Today I'm speaking with Roger Rickard. Roger is, as I know him for years, the Mr. Advocacy of our industry, and he even told me how to pronounce the word. He's going to be speaking about what we can do as business owners in terms of advocacy, especially in this challenging time, but also looking at the long term. Enjoy listening to Roger Rickard. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meeting podcast. Today, I am speaking with the icon of advocacy in our industry, Mr. Roger Rickard. Roger, how are you?
Eric, I am lovely, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. And as you heard, I learned how to pronounce advocacy.
Well, you know, it's so funny, Eric, because you used to say advocacy, and every time you would say that to me, we might have been out somewhere, and I always thought you needed more vodka for your drink. So advocacy. I thought you were actually speaking Spanish. Advocacy.
Exactly. No, it is a very difficult word for me to pronounce.
Yeah. But you've mastered it, my friend.
Thank you. You're going to explain to us that in a minute. But before we get there, Roger, I'd like to go back to you, to your life, to how did you get into the meetings and event industry, because you were not starting that in your career, right?
I like to tell people that I had two pillars in my history, and now I have a third. But the first two pillars were one of government affairs, government advocacy, politics, and I my education is in political science and public service. And so that one pillar was one that I began literally at 13 years old and has been throughout my life in one fashion. But when I was in college and university, I took a job working in a hotel, but not the typical job someone has in a hotel. I actually worked in hotel security.
Oh,
and so
yeah, when people don't see it, if they watch on YouTube or hear you, but you're 6'8"?
6'8", my friend.
Right, and you're the type of people, quite frankly, when you don't know, if I don't know you, I don't want to be crossing your path in the middle of the night on the street, right?
Well, there was a day and time when that might have been true, but I'm not so sure that applies today. But thank you.
So you start in security.
I started in security, and because I worked at nice hotels, you know, I was in suits and ties every day, and my job was to learn how to diffuse things and lower the temperature rather than try to, I wasn't a bar bouncer per se. My job was to make sure that we kept things quiet, and when things didn't go right, that we dealt with them very discreetly, got them away from that. And that I actually worked for a private firm that was contracted to those hotels, and that rolled into a job that I had where they trained me professionally to be a professional bodyguard as well, which was kind of fun for a while.
Wow. And is it true that Kevin Costner came to get advice from you when they had to shoot the movie?
I was the on-location advisor. Nah, that's not true. I don't want to start that rumor, but I will tell you, as weird as it is, the movie Bodyguard has some true application to it in many ways, and I'll leave it at that.
Interesting.
Without divulging things.
Well, one thing I'd like you to divulge, and to protect the innocent, and if that person is still alive, to protect you. Let's call this person Peter, and let's say that Peter is from Brussels, so that, you know, we're not identifying more specifically. But if you can tell that story, because I just love it.
Well, Peter from Brussels was a part of an organized group of people that were less than honest and less than upfront in their business dealings. And Peter was in town, and one of Peter's bodyguards hit on one of my clients. And when I say hit on, he tried to pick up the woman, and he tried to go with her, and her husband was there. And it started a standoff that would have gotten very ugly very quick. And I happened to step in and dispose. Well, no, let me be very careful here. And I'll be very candid with it. We got into a big altercation as I was protecting the client. By the time we were done, Peter's bodyguard was laying on the floor, crying, wincing, and Peter's bodyguard was fired. But the rumor the next day was that there was a legal document, often called a contract.
A contract on your head.
A contract on my head because I took care of Peter's bodyguard. I was scared to death. I ended up having to have a meeting with Peter and to confront it face to face. And Peter respected the fact that I came to him and said, I heard this rumor and I want to set it straight. The funny thing is, Peter offered me a job. I turned Peter down. And actually, there was great respect between Peter and I, and we had run into each other, I don't know, maybe 6, 8, 10 times later, and we just had a mutual respect. But the story is much more fun when you can be more flamboyant with the true facts.
I imagine. Is that where your love of face-to-face meeting come from?
Well, it was kind of face to face that day. You're absolutely right. No, I will tell you though, working in hotels and seeing what transpired in the meetings and everything. And I lived back east. I moved out west at that point in time, and then proceeded to work in different positions in hotels in different ways. And really got to know and understand the meetings industry, and then expand to where I went out and went to work. I owned a DMC. I owned a destination management company in the industry, and then actually sold that and went to work for an organization that was national in scope and did high-end corporate incentive programs. So I had a lot of different touch points, but along the way, and that's my meetings pillar, if you will, but along the way, that other pillar, the government affairs pillar and the advocacy pillar came into place because of the meetings industry. Mm-hmm. There was a boycott that happened in the state of Arizona in the early 1990s over whether the government was willing to celebrate the Martin Luther King Day holiday that we celebrated earlier this week, in fact, or in January. And that boycott cost the state of Arizona a tremendous amount of meetings business. And it was the first time that meetings were used as a tool to get back at government for their actions. That got me very involved. I then got very involved with Meeting Professionals International. Then I sit at the time on their government affairs committee. Then I led their committee and blah, 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 blah. And then that led me to create programs of how to teach people to be better advocates so that they could speak out when they felt that issues by government or other groups was affecting their ability to do their business, to run their business, to be leaders in their business. Yeah. And that led to virtually where I'm at today.
Yeah, so let's back up just two things quickly. First one, obviously, we're recording this in January. So if you're listening a little later, don't think that Roger doesn't know when Martin Luther King Day is. He does know very well. And a second, and I think that's very interesting in what you just said, is about the fact that when you're talking about advocacy in our industry, what you're kind of describing, there's two ways. There's the advocacy towards everything related to government and public affairs, but it's also the advocacy of demonstrating how good you are, that you're a leader in your field, regardless of your industry. Is that correct?
Oh, Eric, absolutely. In fact, one of the speaking programs that I do a segment of myth busting about advocacy, because advocacy is your ability to speak in favor of or write in favor of a cause or an issue or something like that. That's advocating. But there are other definitions of that. And an advocate is a person who pleads the cause of maybe another person as well. So it divides and goes into two areas. One thing I do with myth busting is that there are 7 branches of an advocacy tree, and we're not going to dive into them, but I will tell you each of the branches. One's the government, the lobbying, the public affairs stuff. Another one's media. Another one's public service. Another one's brand. What is your brand positioning and advocating is? What about industry advocacy? What does a whole industry believe in? What about cause? What about wounded warriors or Mothers Against Drunk Driving or the Susan G. Komen Foundation? And then people. How are people used in the ability to be able to advocate for things? So that's that whole pillar there. But the other side of that is, and particularly business leaders. And this applies whether or not these business leaders are in the meetings industry or not. But as a leader, you must have the ability to advocate on behalf of your customers and clients and prospects. Mm-hmm. You have to have the ability to be able to advocate for your employees. You have to have the ability to advocate for your vendors and your suppliers. Because the cog, the gears of how business works, you know this so very well, Eric, it works because they're all moving in one direction. If your employees aren't happy because of the way that they've been treated or don't feel you stand up for them, don't feel you protect them, that cog isn't going to run as well as it should. Mm-hmm. If your customers aren't comfortable, if your prospects aren't comfortable, they're not going to be your customers. Mm-hmm. And when I mean advocate, if you don't stand up and defend and plead and work with them and share responsibility, your vendors and suppliers are not going to be there when you need them the most. Mm-hmm. But if you have those relationships, if you're a leader with those kind of relationships where you treat equally and advocate on behalf of all of them, then everyone will be there. Everyone will go that extra 10% that we talk about, right, to make things successful. And that's really about advocacy leadership, if I would call it that.
Got it. Now, going back to what you said about Arizona, the industry coming together and recognizing Martin Luther King Day, there's also a great example about our industry coming together. And I remember our common friend, Michael Owen, speaking about what he and many other people did in Nashville when it was a question about building this conference center or not. And now we see how big the impact on the city it had. So after what is going on now, go ahead, sorry.
Let me add another example. And Michael's example and what was done in Nashville is a great, almost current day example. But years ago when they were expanding the Baltimore Convention Center, the way that the governance of the way the Baltimore Convention Center works, they had to get approval from the state legislature. And so all those legislators outside of the city of Baltimore didn't care. Why do we give them? We always give money to Baltimore. We never give it to anywhere else until you figured out that all of the chicken farmers in the eastern side of the state of Maryland got the business to sell chickens for the conventions at the convention center. And we all know that we get a lot of chicken dinners at these things. So they went to the chicken farmers and said, hey, if we expand this, we're going to have sales of this, much higher revenue sales. So will you support expanding the convention center? All the chicken farmers said, hallelujah, we're in. And they went to their legislators and said, expand the convention center. It's good for our business in Eastern Maryland.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Now, going back to the business owners in our industry, they own a business. There's a lot of things going on, obviously, with the pandemic, but the business in general, there's always something. When it comes to advocacy, what could be the role and the involvement of business owners in our industry that, we do represent, and we know that entrepreneurs in general and small business are really the heart of employment in our country. But what can be their involvement based on the time that they have and the size of their company, which is quite small?
Actually, they can be the most important advocate in the mix.
How?
I have 7 actions of highly effective advocates. It's a pocket guide book that I wrote. I called them actions because a person doesn't have to go 1, 2, 3, 4 down through the steps. You can do any one of them. One of them is your ability to get on the record, your ability to tell your story. It doesn't matter. Media, as an example, as I was talking, one of the branches of advocacy, media wants to hear from the average person on the street. And so if a small business owner, and this story was actually told this year, a great example of it was told in upstate New York, where a small business owner reached out to then the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, and said, my business is failing because they were in the trade show. They made trade show booths. And they said, nobody's buying a booth. Nobody's using a booth. We can't ship a booth because there's no events. And my employees, I can't keep them on payroll. And that means they won't be able to pay for their mortgages. Mm-hmm. They may not have food, and all the things that we know now because of this pandemic has affected us.
Right.
And that single small business owner reached out to Schumer's office and said, I'm not going to survive. And Schumer happened to be going to an area of New York, Rochester, New York, where this guy's business was. And so Schumer's office invited him to be at this event where all the media was, mm-hmm. and allowed him to tell his personal story about what's happening with his employees. Now, we don't think that Rochester, New York is the hotbed of trade shows in our meetings industry, mm-hmm. but a vendor was there. Mm-hmm. And a vendor who had employees couldn't do his business because of what was going on. And the government, and the media combined told that story, got that story out. Banks gave him more loans, said, hang in, we're going to help you. We're going to be there for you. So that small business owner was smart enough to tell his story, and he got a lot of public sentiment, and he got a lot of actual support for the business because of their ability to be a leader and to speak out. So small businesses, which make up a high majority of the people in the meetings and events industry, they have this incredible power to tell their personal story.
Yeah, I like the story. Now, to be very concrete in the long terms, obviously, not every vendor will know a politician, and not every vendor will know a politician in an election year, but more into our industry in the long term. What can we do? I know there's organization like Meeting Mean Business Coalition, Exhibition Means Business as well, that David Dubois, our friend, launched. Can you speak a little bit about that and about what could be the role of each business owner that not necessarily will take them days out of their business and still will have a bigger impact?
I often use a quote in some of my speeches from former President Dwight David Eisenhower, who said politics ought to be the part-time profession of any citizen. And it goes on, but that's the key part of that quote. And what he's really saying is, and why I use it as an example, is part-time. We don't have to change our lifestyle to have a huge impact. And I'll push back slightly, Eric, that this guy did not know, that I gave you the example, did not know Chuck Schumer. Literally reached out to a local office and said, is the senator going to do something? I'm dying. My business is dying.
Right.
And he was just smart enough to reach out. He didn't have internal connections. Mm-hmm. Smart politicians use personal stories as the vehicle to tell the bigger story
Right.
of what's going on. So anybody has the ability to reach out. Anybody has the ability to go out and try to get other stakeholders. And if you feel you can't, then join in, be a part of Meetings Mean Business and be a part of the Global Meetings Industry Day in April to be able to speak out about the size and scope and the importance of the industry and tell the story of not only our economic impact, our jobs impact, but how we connect the dots between how business A gets done and how people advance their businesses through education and training.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a very good point. And can you speak a little bit more about what the work of Meetings Mean Business Coalition and Exhibition Means Business is as well, for those who would not know about it, and how they can join that?
Well, meetingsmeanbusiness.com is a site that can help you understand the size, scope, and value of the industry as a whole, because that's always important to take the macro look of this and to be able to say, we're very important. And you and I remember being in Washington, D.C. at a press club event at the National Press Club, where they were talking about research that was being done by a third party about the size of the industry. And at that point in time in our life, the meetings industry was much larger than the U.S. auto manufacturing industry. And at that point in time, government was saying, the auto industry's too big to fail. We have to bail them out. And yet they were saying we shouldn't be doing the meetings. Yeah. Wait a minute. We're a bigger industry. Hello? And people didn't know that. So part of what Meetings Mean Business does by running the Global Meetings Industry Day is help provide a public relations, a public service announcement all day on that specific day about the value of meetings, the value of face-to-face, why it's important to meet, why it's important to continue to support those businesses, and all the suppliers that rely on the fact that people do meet, do get educated, do learn, do share great ideas, do share the ability to do commerce together through the vehicle and the marketing vehicle of face-to-face meetings and events. Contrary, the same thing with Exhibitions Mean Business. I've had the pleasure of working with our good friend David Dubois for the last 8 years on that. And that's slightly different in that we also have a public relations component, a public service component to the size and scope of exhibitions and trade shows. But we also have a legislative input. And we have gone every year except for June of this year, or June of 2020. We have gone to DC personally and met with representatives and talked about our story, and were able to help influence and tweak and change different pieces of legislation. And so that fight continues. I'm pleased to report that, unfortunately, our industry almost all the time has been reactionary rather than proactive.
Yeah.
And we've reacted. And as I often say, it's really difficult to call the fire insurance company and say, can I get an insurance policy when the fireman's at the door?
Yeah.
It's too late. And to be an effective advocate, you can't all of a sudden say today, I'm going to be an advocate and I'm going to call somebody and I'm going to get something done. So you must learn how to be effective in communicating and protecting and speaking up for the different people in your organization, your customers, as the list that I went through earlier, and the list of the different branches. Speak up for your industry to protect it.
Regarding the Exhibition Mean Business, so you're going on the Hill, you're meeting with congresswomen and congressmen, and you speaking about industry. What did you do last year when everybody was at home with the mask?
So here's the interesting thing. We've averaged, when you're asking people to take 2 or 3 days and at their own expense and go to Washington, D.C. and spend a day on the Hill, as rewarding as it is, as effective as it is, you limit your audience based on the time and people being busy and traveling a lot in normal pre-pandemic industry circumstances. And so with that, we would always average about 125 people. This year, because the industry was under siege through the pandemic, first to be closed down, probably last to really open fully. I don't think there's much of a question about that. And so we closed down all meetings, events, exhibitions, all that stuff primarily stopped completely. And now people had a little bit of time, so we made it a virtual event. And so instead of 125 people, we had 1,600 people register.
Wow.
For our legislative action day with exhibitions mean business. And people showed up. We taught them what to do. We gave them the resources of who to reach out to. We created messaging that was consistent with the impact of our industry and asking for the things that would help the industry survive and come back. And that's a complex list that everything goes from the Paycheck Protection Program to PPE, the protection equipment, to supporting, making sure that airlines don't collapse on us, because once it's safe to go, we need a way to go. Yeah. And if the airlines aren't there to do that, if we can't get from point A to point B, so there was a whole list of things that need to be taken into consideration. And by the way, we weren't the only groups. And in fact, the beauty of this is one of the successful tactics of advocacy is forming alliances and building coalitions. And so we formed alliances, joined alliances that included the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and National Retail and National Restaurant and the National Hotel and the U.S. Travel. And we continued to build this umbrella that got bigger and bigger and bigger because everybody needed the same things.
Awesome. Congratulations and thank you for that. That's awesome.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. Thank you. It's a pleasure to work with it. I love the industry. I love standing up for the industry. I love teaching people that advocacy is bigger than just government and just lobbying. Eric, I love creating tomorrow's leaders. I love working with the young that we know have a passion, that want to speak out. They don't know how yet.
That's awesome. Roger, my last question for today. When we meet in 1 year with a bottle of champagne, what are we going to celebrate?
I'm working on a new book. The writing is almost complete. He says, making a face. And it is, you are the driver, the government is the car. And it's taken from a quote of Ronald Reagan, where he talked about how we drive the government. We tell the government what it needs to do, how it needs to do it. We tell it where to turn, when to stop, when to speed up. And the government's just simply the vehicle that we can use. And I want people to really understand that they have enough voice, enough power, and enough clout to be able to affect the direction that this country goes in, whether it's the country, state, city, whatever. And it's the same for people's businesses. But that's the next book. We'll be celebrating it being a bestseller, and it might involve a good cigar, my friend.
I'm ready for that. Roger, how do people get in touch with you?
They can go to voicesinadvocacy.com, or they can email me directly at Roger, which is ROGER, at voicesinadvocacy.com. I'd love to hear their comments, their thoughts, their agreements, or their disagreements with what we had to say today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm and everything you're doing. And thank you again for being on the Business of Meetings podcast.
What a great pleasure. Thank you for having it, Eric.
Thank you, Roger, for sharing with us your experience and all your knowledge about advocacy. And I can't wait to read your 7-step of an advocate. And I know that people can get in touch with you as well at roger@voicesinadvocacy.com. And if you want to get in touch with me, please reach out on LinkedIn and join us on the Facebook group, www.eventbusinessformula.com/group, where we share information and knowledge for all the business owners in our industry. Thank you.